and welcome to CrimeDivers. I'm Jill, and it's just me again today. So this is the third of the episodes that we recorded but lost the sound, and Laura wasn't available to re-record, so I've had to do it myself. But next week, Laura will be back. So today we are in the UK, and our episode is called Murder on the Towpath. So let's dive in. Today we're going to be talking about the murders of a 16-year-old Barbara Songhurst and 18-year-old Christine Reed. They were best friends and had met about a year before through their shared love of jazz music and dancing. Barbara was born in Terrington, London on the 29th of April 1937. Her parents were Gertrude and Daniel, and she was born somewhere in the middle of 9 or 10 kids. A couple of the older kids had already moved out, but they were still really cramped, living in a 3-bedroom council house, struggling to make ends meet. Daniel, the dad, he had to live in a steel jacket because he had broken his back and he couldn't work. So Gertrude did as best as she could, but obviously it was hard to hold down a job, be her husband's carer and have all those kids to look after. So they relied on benefits and whatever the kids could make doing part-time jobs when they weren't at school. When Barbara left school, she got a job as an assistant in a chemist, and more than half of what she earned went to her mum to help pay bills and, buy food for the family. She was described as bubbly and fun, and she was popular with the boys as she was so pretty. She liked to flirt with boys and enjoyed their company, but she was saving herself for marriage. She was sensible, trustworthy, and was always careful and cautious. She wouldn't talk to strangers, and she didn't stray too far away from home. Her best friend, Christine Reed, she was born on the 18th of March 1935. Her mum and dad were Herbert and Lucy, and she was the middle child of 3. They also weren't very well off. Her dad worked in a shop, and her mum was a stay-at-home mum. She was deaf, and, back then it wasn't very easy to get a job, not being able to hear. They were a happy family, though, and made the most of what they had. Later, Christine's mum described her daughter as being of low intelligence and illiterate, yet markedly beautiful and compassionate. She got through school and she got a job as a machinist in a factory, and like Barbara, she gave half or just over half of her wage to her parents to help pay the bills. She also got a lot of attention from boys, and she was quite shy, but once she got comfortable with them, she would be quite chatty, and she was also, saving herself for marriage. She was also sensible and trustworthy, and when they were out together, even if they stayed out late, their parents were never worried about them. The two girls were like sisters. They only lived a few streets apart, and they spent as much time together as they could. They both loved cycling, and they both saved up their wages to buy themselves bikes, and they would often cycle along the River Thames and along the Towpath and over the bridges and, just out in the fresh air, doing something that they loved. So that brings us to May 1953. The Second World War had finished 8 years ago, and that had left Britain financially drained. Many districts were still recovering from the Blitz, and memories were still fresh from the Great Smog, which was only 6 months ago in December 1952. So for anyone who doesn't know, the Great Smog was a severe air pollution event that lasted from the 5th till the 9th of December in 1952. It was way colder than normal. And that, along with windless conditions, collected airborne pollutants, mostly arising from the use of coal, and it formed a thick layer of smog across the city. Because it was so cold, people were burning more coal, and basically because Britain had got into debt because of the war, they had to get the cheaper stuff, so the cheaper coal, and that was low grade, and it increased the amount of sulfur dioxide in the smoke. So this caused major disruptions as people could hardly see outside. So I'm assuming, from what I actually I actually knew about the smog just from watching an episode of The Crown, which is on Netflix, and it's about the royal family. And they had an episode that involved that and the smog, and there was like road accidents and things. So I'm assuming that actually did happen. And of course, people were being made ill and dying from inhaling the smog. It's estimated that between 10 and 12,000 people died as a result of it. So anyway, Queen Elizabeth's coronation was coming up now. So people were getting excited for the celebrations. As I said, like, you know, you're still recovering from the war. The smog had only been a few months earlier, but now the sun was out and, you know, it was warm, you know, and things are always better with a bit of sun. And as we know, Britain's weather is so unpredictable. So the sun coming out and the celebrations coming up just, you know, led people to be happy, and they were in the mood for celebrations. And a lot of people went to the River Thames, the banks of the River Thames. People were like having picnics there, they were camping out. Everyone was just taking advantage of this happy time as everyone saw this coronation as a new beginning. Unfortunately, though, not everyone was taking advantage in a good way. On the 24th of May, 1953, a 14-year-old girl was walking her dog in Oxshott Heath and Woods, and she walked past a guy who was just hanging around on his bike. But as she passed him, he started following her until she was on a more secluded path. He then snuck up behind her, whacked her over the back of the head with like an axe-like instrument. He then dragged her into the bushes and raped her and just left her lying there. Luckily, she survived, and she described her attacker to the police, as did an eyewitness who had saw him following her. So they both said that he was young, dark-haired, and was wearing blue overalls and brown gloves. Another witness had seen a man matching that description waiting for a bus nearby, and that would have been shortly after the attack. And the witness also said that the man had a cleft chin. A facial composite was created and distributed throughout the media. On the 12th of June, a 46-year-old woman was walking her dog in Windsor Great Park, and a young man approached her and asked her for directions to the Holly Tree pub. She started to give him directions, but he grabbed her and dragged her into the bushes and sexually assaulted her, and she gave the same description as the 14-year-old girl had. A few days later, on the 17th of June, two guys spotted a man matching his description sitting on a tree stump near Oxshott railway station, and they recognised him as someone that they had previously worked with. And this was 22-year-old Alfred Charles Whiteway. He was taken to the police station for questioning, but he was let go because he wasn't considered... He was let go because he wasn't considered to closely resemble the identikit of the suspect. So for now, police didn't have any other suspects for this attack. So that was June. But we're going to rewind back to the Sunday, the 31st of May. So this would be a week after the 14-year-old girl was attacked, but before the 46-year-old woman was attacked. And we're going back to Barbara and Christine. So Barbara and Christine, they'd had a sleepover the night before at Christine's house. At 10 a.m, they went over to Barbara's house so that she could get changed, as they had been out dancing the night before. They were happy. They were looking forward to the coronation, which was in 2 days' time. And Barbara was going to be taking part in a swimming costume beauty pageant thing as part of the celebrations. It was a nice day, so the girls decided to get on their bikes and cycle to a place called Teddington Lock to meet three boys that one of them knew. And these boys were John Wells, Albert Sparks and Peter Warren. They were camping out there by the river for a few days. So the girls, they had to cycle down a towpath to get there, but they knew the place well and they cycled there regularly. So once they got to Teddington Lock, where the boys were, they just ran around, having a bit of fun. Things like the boys hid the girls' bikes, they played tag, they played hide and seek. There's a game of what me and my friends used to call either kiss, cuddle or torture, or kiss, cuddle or snog. So basically you run around, you catch a person and they decide whether they want a kiss, a cuddle or a snog, or if they don't want to do any of that, they can get torture. Anyway, it was they played some sort of version of that game. So there was some kissing, but that was as far as it went. It was just all a bit of innocent fun. So the girls popped back to Christine's for lunch, and then they went back to hang out with the boys in the afternoon. Then they popped back to Christine's again for their dinner later on, and then about 8 p.m. they went back to the campsite. They stayed there till nearly midnight. Then they thought they better get their asses home before their parents, started wondering where they were, because they didn't want to get in any trouble, obviously. So the boys walked with them to the towpath, and as Barbara's new bike didn't have a light on it yet, one of the boys gave her a loan of his, as he wouldn't be using his bike that night. So the following morning, the 1st of June 1953, some men from the Port of London Authority arrived at Teddington to do some repairs on the river embankment. And at 8:15 a.m, they spotted something in the water. They looked closer and they saw it was the body of a teenage girl. They immediately called the police. And when they pulled her out and took her for examination, they could see that she had been hit over the head with an axe, or an axe-like object, and her skull was fractured, and she had been stabbed repeatedly. Her autopsy showed that she had been struck on her left cheek, and that had fractured her cheekbone. She had 3 stab wounds to her back, and all of those stab wounds had punctured her lungs. She had also been raped before being put in the water. They soon identified the girl as 16-year-old Barbara Songhurst. When she hadn't came home the night before, her parents had just assumed that she had stayed at Christine's house again, so they weren't worried, and they had expected her to be home that day. But when police informed them that they had found Barbara's body, they then spoke, they told them that Barbara had been with her friend Christine, so the police went to Christine's house and realised that she hadn't arrived home the night before either. Detective Superintendent Herman Hannam from Scotland Yard opened a murder investigation. So he sent frogmen into the river, and something like 20,000 people were watching, and he wanted a 3-mile section of the River Thames dredged, as they realised that Christine had probably been murdered as well, so obviously they needed to find her. So they quickly found the murder site on the towpath, as there was blood. They found blood over the gravel and the grass, and then they found a pair of ladies' shoes, and then shortly afterwards they found another pair which the police were pretty sure belonged to Christine. 2 days later they found Christine's bike in the river, and 4 days later they found Christine's body. So that was exactly a week after the murders, and the police team dragging the river reached Glover's Island, which is 2 miles downstream from Teddington Lock, and they found her floating in the water. Like Barbara, Christine had also been hit over the head with like an axe or something similar. She had been stabbed repeatedly. She had 6 stab wounds to her back, 6 stab wounds to her chest, and 1 above her left wrist. One of the wounds to her back had pierced her lung, and 4 of the wounds to her chest had entered her heart. She had been brutally raped as she died. And the pathologist was able to determine that she had actually still been alive when she was thrown into the river. Both women had numerous cuts and bruises on their arms and their hands from when they tried to defend themselves, but the murderer was thought to have been likely, quote, a man of unusual strength. So they did fight, but unfortunately they were just no match for him. The violence of the attacks shocked even the experienced police, and this investigation became one of the largest murder hunt that England had seen for years. Initially, the police did think that it was two men because of all of the violence and the fact that there was two victims, because they were thinking, surely it would be hard to subdue one without the other one fighting, to try and stop them. But one guy had said, well, actually, I don't think it was two guys because the attacks were pretty much the same. So it would be a massive coincidence if two men, even if they were together, if they were like, right, we're going to murder these girls, but it would be a massive coincidence if they carried out the exact same attack at the same time. So the murders were all over the news, and the papers reported every day on every single update. There were appeals for witnesses to come forward, and there were searches for the murder weapon, which they were assuming was an axe, but they couldn't find it. They also never found Barbara's bike, so police wondered if the killer had taken it when he fled the scene. Over 1,600 men were questioned and eliminated throughout the inquiry. Also, several known sex offenders were also interrogated and also eliminated as suspects. So the press, they were pretty sure that he would strike again, and they were right. The 46-year-old woman that I told you about earlier, when she described him to the police, she told them that he had taken off on a bike. Obviously, at the time, they didn't know if it was the same man who had killed Christine and Barbara, but they were putting two and two together and figuring out it was the same man who had attacked the 14-year-old as who had attacked the 46-year-old. So police and reporters were knocking on doors and asking around. They questioned the boys that Christine and Barbara had spent that day with, but they said they hadn't followed them onto the towpath, and there were other campers who could vouch for them. Another couple of boys who were camping actually said that they heard screams coming from the towpath, and they did try to see what was going on, but it was pitch black, and they couldn't really see anything. They couldn't figure out where the noise was coming from, and then the screams stopped. So they just thought it was probably just teenagers mucking about, and then they just went on their way. Because the area was such a secluded place, the police assumed that the killer was a local man, because it's not really somewhere that strangers would know. They also reckoned that to manage to overpower both of the girls, one of the girls was probably quite a bit further ahead than the other, and then the man's jumped out, threw the axe at her head or torso and knocked her off her bike. Then he's quickly overpowered the other girl by throwing a knife at her, and then he's brutally raped them, stabbed them, and threw them in the river. So that's what they were thinking. On the 28th of June, Alfred Whiteway was arrested in connection with the sexual assault on the 46-year-old lady that we talked about earlier. This was the same guy who had matched the description, but they had let him go before. The 14-year-old girl who had been raped also positively identified Alfred in an identity parade as the man who attacked her. So the police searched his house and they found a pair of crepe-soled shoes. They had been recently washed, so the police took them for forensic testing, and they found traces of human blood in the seam and the eyelets of the right shoe. So Alfred Charles Whiteway was born in London on the 21st of June 1931. His mum was a domestic servant, and his dad had unfortunately died of cancer when Alfred was 14. So they were poor, as he had 8 siblings. So, obviously his mum was a single parent now. 9 kids, that's a lot of kids to provide for. From a young age, Alfred was in trouble with police, and as a teenager, he appeared repeatedly before juvenile court, and he ended up being sent to a reform school, but he was still badly behaved. It's believed that he either had learning difficulties that just weren't identified, or he was, quote, inattentive, disinclined to learn, and just wasn't interested in learning. In 1948, he spent some time in prison for theft, but when he was released, he managed to find work in construction, and co-workers later said that they remembered his great strength. Like, he could climb scaffolding just using his arms, so he must have had some strength to be able to do that. Some of them also remembered his temper and the fact that he had an obsession with knives, and he was really good at knife throwing and axe throwing, and that he did both of those activities as a hobby. He met a girl called Nellie, and one day he just saw her in the street and he followed her and started chatting to her, and they started seeing each other. But her mother didn't approve. She didn't like Alfred. So Nellie and Alfred purposely got pregnant so that her mother would give her permission to get married. So they did get married, and by 1953 he was the father of a little girl who was just under 2, and Nellie was pregnant again. He didn't live with Nellie though. Her parents, even though they were married, her parents still approved of him. So she lived with her parents and daughter, and he lived with his mum, his uncle and his siblings in a tiny terraced house, which was less than a mile away from the scene of the Towpath murders. And they didn't just not live with each other. They weren't even allowed. He wasn't even allowed in Nellie's parents' house. So they were married. They had a daughter. She was pregnant again, but still her parents wouldn't let him in the house. So whenever they saw each other, they would go and sit on her mum and dad's doorstep and like have a cup of tea or cup of coffee together. And obviously they had intimate time because she got pregnant twice, but they would just go and do that up an alley. So very romantic. So Alfred, he was being held on remand for the previous assaults, for the 14-year-old girl and the 46-year-old woman. So it gave the police time to investigate the murders while keeping him off the streets so that he couldn't attack again. D.S. Hannam questioned him and compared his account with statements from his wife and his mother-in-law, because he said that he'd been at his wife's house that night, but the mother-in-law was like, no, he wasn't. You know, she'd said that Nellie was in bed, you know, by 11 o'clock or whatever, and he'd gotten. So there was just countless discrepancies, and his story just wasn't adding up. One day, a police officer called Arthur Kosh heard that Alfred was the main suspect in the Towpath murders, and he remembered something. On the 18th of June, so that would have been 10 days before, Arthur had been cleaning his police car and he found an axe under the driver's seat. So he just decided to keep a hold of it. He just put it in his locker. You know, obviously I'm not in the police, I don't really know how things work, but I don't know, I just thought there would be a lost and found, or, well, for an axe, you'd be wondering why there's actually a weapon or a tool in his car. So you'd think he would actually sort of ask around, investigate, you know, speak to people that had been in his car that day. I have no idea. But anyway, he just put it in his locker, and he thought that a member of the public would come forward and ask about it. But no one did. So he decided to take it home, and he had been using it to chop wood. So he was like, when he found out that, you know, Alfred was a suspect and it could have been an axe that had been used, he was like, oh shit, this could be the murder weapon. And it turned out that when Alfred had first been taken to the police station on the 17th of June in connection with the 46-year-old's assault, he'd had the axe hidden in his overalls. So when he'd been put into the police car, he put it under the driver's seat so that he wouldn't get caught with it. So a forensic examination of the tool was carried out, but there was no physical evidence linking it to Alfred, but the axe's dimensions perfectly matched the wounds inflicted on both murder victims. D.S. Hannum, he was still going hard on Alfred, questioning him and trying to get a confession out of him. And when he told Alfred that they had found blood on his shoe, which was the same blood type as Barbara, it was also his as well. Because back then, obviously they could just check your blood type and that was about it. So he did have the same blood type as Barbara, but D.S. Hannum was like, no, this is Barbara's blood. And he also told him that they had his axe, that they'd found the axe in the car. So Alfred, he finally cracked. He told D.S. Hannum that he couldn't control himself around women, and he confessed to killing Barbara and Christine. He said initially he had only seen one of the girls. He didn't realise there was two. So obviously, one of them had been further ahead and he didn't realise there was one further behind her. So he said, quote, he bashed her about the head and she went down like a log. And then he heard the other girl scream down by the lock, and he said to shut her up. Sorry. And then he said that he shut her up with his weapons. And he said that the reason that he had killed the girls was because the second girl was Barbara. And he knew her and knew that she would be able to identify him. So when he saw Christine, he just thought, because she was obviously the one that was further ahead, he just thought she was by herself. So he had decided to incapacitate her and assault her like he had with the 14-year-old and the 46-year-old. And then he was just going to sexually assault her and then leave her there. But obviously Barbara came along and saw him and screamed, and he was like, oh shit. He decided he had to kill them both. So 22-year-old Alfred Whiteway was charged for Barbara's murder. Apparently he could only be charged for one murder. I'm not sure why. And his trial began on the 26th of October 1953 at the Old Bailey. In court, he pleaded not guilty and said that he hadn't confessed at all. He said that he had just been given some sheets of paper and was told to sign them. The blood on his shoes, he claimed that was from where he had cut himself shaving, and he also said that he had cut himself at work around the same time. But the jury deliberated for 48 minutes and they found Alfred guilty and he was sentenced to death. After he left the dock, the judge ordered that the charges against him for Christine's murder and the two separate charges of rape and assault with attempt to rape and robbery for what he had initially been arrested for, they were to be left on file. So I'm not quite sure how that worked, why he wasn't, charged and sentenced for those things. I don't know. But he appealed his sentence and that was rejected the same day. And Alfred Whiteway was hanged at Wandsworth Prison on the 22nd of December 1953. And by this time his wife had given birth to a second daughter, and one of the last things he did was send them a Christmas card. But I did just think that the whole thing was over and done with really quickly, considering now how long the process takes, from the actual crime to the punishment. But, this was 1953 and he murdered the girls on the 31st of May and he was hanged just 7 months later. So I did think that was over quick. But yeah, so that was the case of the Towpath murders. And next week, Laura will be here, assuming that we don't somehow manage to lose sound again. I have no idea how that happened. I'm not the best with technology. So, fingers crossed she'll be here next week, and thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.